Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. A major settlement between BP, the federal government, and 5 states could have cash flowing like oil from a broken pipe. We'll look at the deal and what to expect. The announcement comes at a time when environmental issues are getting more global attention. According to a recent encyclical by Pope Francis, climate change is a cross the world has to bear. This new attitude from Rome combines religion with science and could have implications on politics, all of which are relevant to Louisiana. We will take a special look tonight at the environment as seen from high places. We'll also look at the latest in the lieutenant governor's race and at one basketball Pelican finding an extremely rich environment. At the altar for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jason Berry, freelance journalist who has covered the Vatican. And Mark Schleifstein, environmental reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. And first to Mark. And it was announced yesterday, big settlement regarding the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
Right, it's huge money. We're talking $18.7 billion. Louisiana Attorney General Buddy Caldwell claims it's the largest individual settlement for Louisiana. Louisiana's portion is the largest individual settlement that any state has ever gotten in the United States from a lawsuit like this. The amount of money that the state's going to get is probably closer to $8.5 billion of that $18 billion, but there are some ifs in the process there. We're talking about a lawsuit that settles federal claims under the Clean Water Act for fines that BP was going to pay for the oil spill happening. Additional federal money that BP has to pay to restore the environment under what's called the Natural Resource Damage Assessment process of the Oil Pollution Act. And then there are private claims that the individual states and localities had with BP that also have all been made part of this global settlement. So this pretty much ends much of what's going on in federal court. Federal Judge Carl Barbier was about to issue a ruling on the Clean Water Act process that could have been as high as $13.7 billion, but this settlement means that they're only putting about $5.5 billion towards that.
So stepping back just a little bit, and in that federal court process, it was in different stages, and the judge found BP grossly negligent.
Right. And that was where he decided that the most that they could get fined was the $13.7 billion based on how much per barrel of oil that was spilled.
And so the Supreme Court just last week, declined to hear a challenge.
Right.
So earlier in the week, declined to hear a challenge. So you think that sort of prompted this agreement?
Oh, that definitely paved the way for this settlement. They could not have reached this settlement if BP's appeal was still before the Supreme Court. So that laid the framework, and everybody was actually expecting the judge to come up with his decision at some point in the next couple of days.
So that was the next phase. Okay,
right.
Errol?
Well, when the announcement was made yesterday, there seemed to be a lot of goodwill, even from the other sides that would traditionally be very critical of this kind of thing. But there seem to be people seem to feel good about it.
Well, I think there are two reasons for that. One is the obvious, which is that people are going to be very happy that this mess is getting over with finally. The other important thing is that this is a huge amount of money that is going to be placed into what I've termed probably the largest environmental experiment in the history of the world. I mean, we're talking about the majority of this money going into coastal or ocean restoration processes. In Louisiana, the biggest chunk of that money is going to end up building coastal wetlands for the state of Louisiana, or at least hopefully, provide us with the opportunity of beginning that process. So I think that has a lot to do with it. But to say that, everybody's on the same page now, that's not quite true. I know that at least one environmental group, Oceana, which actually does represent, they believe they represent the sea. They contend that this settlement doesn't go far enough, that it should have been the total $13.7 billion at least on the Clean Water Act fines, and as much as $30 billion for the natural resource damage assessment.
But one interview I saw with Walter Leger, who was one of the lead negotiators, that they made the point that they feel good about it because at the same time they didn't want it to end with BP going out of business, because they said if that happens, it doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, there's been some speculation about that, but I personally don't think that that was a serious problem in terms of this settlement itself. Remember that they still have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of claims that are still outstanding from the industries that were hurt from the moratorium that was put in place by the federal government. That these businesses have filed suit against BP, saying the moratorium would not have existed if it hadn't been for them. So that's, they're still facing some things, but most of BP's problems right at the moment are a result of the fall of oil prices, and that's really, Saudi Arabia's bailiwick. They've been, at the very beginning of this process, they were fairly quick at recouping the initial losses of about $40 billion in the first 2 years that they had actually spent. And I'm not quite sure, especially the way that this thing is put together, it gives them a 15-year process to pay off that money, so that definitely is helpful.
So a few quick questions for you here. The Restore Act, that was related to the Clean Water Act fines, the environmental fines, correct?
Right.
And
so
80% of that has to go to coastal restoration?
Well, 80% of that goes to projects that are allowed under the Restore Act, and that in Louisiana it will go largely to coastal restoration, although a tiny bit of that may be able to be used for infrastructure projects and maybe even for levees. But other places in the coast, a bit broader ability of using that money for some economic losses.
And so the Clean Water Act, the environmental fines could have been as much as $13.7 billion.
That's correct.
If we had waited for the judge to.
Well,
and so what do we think
yes
the judge would have come up with?
Okay, yes and no. The judge ruled that was the maximum amount that he could do, but the reality is that there's this 8-stage process that he has to go through to get that final number, and each one of those stages would have resulted in that number dropping significantly. My estimate, based on what I saw, was that it may have gotten as high as $7 billion instead of the 5.
And so the settlement again is over 6 billion?
It's total?
No, for the clean water.
It's $5.5 billion.
Okay, so 5.5 as opposed to the potential of 13.7. Is that what the state has been saying they were expecting to come out of this?
The states tried to avoid making predictions. So they've not really.
But when that master plan came out, they kept pointing to, okay, this potentially what we could get.
Right. My memory says that they were looking at about $3 billion that they expected at the large end and $800 million at the low end.
Errol, you had another
Well,
one?
this may be a fallacy, but as people look back at Katrina and they say, Katrina opened up funding sources to fix things that may have never been fixed were it not for that. Will we look back one day and say that BP opened up a flow of cash to fix environmental issues that may have never been fixed?
Yeah, except that it's not one day, it's right now. I mean, the reality is that BP already has put into play, this spill has put into play about $2 billion that has come to the state of Louisiana that projects are being built on the ground today.
And that wouldn't have been there.
That money would not have been there. The state would be fighting with the federal government over quite a few things. They're already in court over rebuilding the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet wetlands and how much the state should pay for that, if they should pay anything. They think they shouldn't. So some of these projects will end up being paid for with BP money.
And we should note also that this still has to be signed off on by the judge.
Right, and the public will have an opportunity to comment on this as well as part of that process. So it'll be a 30 to 60 day process in which they go through this whole completion of what this agreement really is.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. And Errol, one of the faces of the BP oil spill in terms of what it was doing to our environment here in Louisiana was at that time Plaquemines Parish President Billy Nungesser. He's now seeking the lieutenant governor's seat. Second time he's seeking that.
Second time he ran in 2011. He represents a parish that's way down in South Louisiana, doesn't have much population, doesn't get much media attention, but BP certainly gave him some statewide media attention and gave him a chance to have a little bit of statewide publicity, being the champion of this sort of issue. So he's one of 4 people that are running again. Now, qualifying hasn't happened yet, so there may be some other people that jump in. But by this stage, anyone who's a really serious candidate is probably out there because you need to be raising money. So you don't wait till the last minute and become a really a serious candidate. But the other people who are running is a guy, kind of an interesting guy named Albert Gilray, who's from Opelousas, and he is the only black Republican in the Senate, state Senate, the only one since Reconstruction days. And trying to mount together a campaign. He's an attorney, and on paper, this combination of Louisiana is so heavily Republican, that helps if you can pull together the black vote, you may have something, but he's not that well known of a candidate. Billy Nunn-Guest, we've talked about, former Plaquemines Parish parish president, will get some support out of the New Orleans area. He ran in 2011, so a little bit of name identity there. I think the person's going to really be maybe if you had to say, and there's no real polls right now. It's too far away and too small of a race, but I would suspect that one of the leaders right now would be John Young, who's the parish president of Jefferson Parish. Jefferson Parish, if you're a Republican for Jefferson Parish and you want to make a move in statewide politics, that's the place to be because it's in a big media center. It's in the New Orleans area media center. You got a lot of Republicans that live in that area, and so it is a good political base. And so just on the strength of that, of being parish president of Jefferson Parish, being a Republican, having no real strong negative, he should be able to make a real showing. Another guy who's really interesting is Kip Holden, who's been the mayor. He's in his 3rd term as mayor of Baton Rouge. And in Baton Rouge, the city and the parish are combined. So if you're mayor of Baton Rouge, you're also president of East Baton Rouge parish president. It's relevant to the story that he's black and he's a Democrat. He's very popular. He seemed to have done a really good job as mayor. And I would think the most likely scenario would be for Holden to wind up in a runoff against one of these other people, and the other people being the Republican in a state that's voting heavily Republican would be a heavy choice. But Holden's a very interesting character and certainly a very accomplished office holder. What's curious about the lieutenant governor's race is you'd think that it would be a real stepping stone for governor, and yet it hardly ever has been, except for Kathleen Blanco. There has been no case in modern time of a sitting lieutenant governor who on his or her own went on to be elected governor. Now, Errol Long succeeded to it. And so it is not really considered, it has not really been a stepping stone to give it. Some states don't even have lieutenant governors anymore. They let the Secretary of State have that responsibility of filling in for the governor. So the job is giving a lot of responsibility for developing tourism. And I've always thought that when you look at these elections, it's curious because the people who run for it, they may be very accomplished people, but they don't always have a lot to do with tourism in their background. But I guess they want to be the ones to change the rule and to be next in line for governor. As the incumbent Jay Darden is, by the way. The incumbent is Jay Darden. I think Jay Darden is hoping that he's in the position as lieutenant governor, that he's got the statewide exposure, that he can be elected governor.
That'll make that move to governor.
Right.
Okay, Errol, thanks a lot. Over to Jason now. Jason, you were in Rome this past month, and you were there during the time of when the encyclical, this recent encyclical by Pope Francis, was indeed issued. What was it like?
It was one of the most exciting experiences of my life. I am involved in a long-term project for a Boston-based online newsroom called the Ground Truth Project. And it's a series on a changing global church, the impact of Pope Francis. All of the articles are cataloged at Ground Truth Project. So I had just arrived, was working with a translator, and all of a sudden, L'Espresso, the Italian news weekly, leaked or got a copy of the document, posted it, and this really set off a hornet's nest. The Vatican immediately announced that this was a heinous breach of the protocol and the ethics. And the guy who did it is really quite a curmudgeon. His name is Sandro Magister, and I would call him a romantic conservative. He is an ultra-Orthodox Catholic who has got long experience and very good sources at the Vatican. And he's really made no secret of the fact that he does not like Pope Francis's agenda. So he put all this stuff out.
So is that why he leaked it? I mean, let's get to what is in the encyclical, too. I mean, was this man really opposed to what the Pope is saying needs to be done? And let me have you talk about what the encyclical says.
Lawyers say calls for an opinion. My opinion is absolutely he was opposed to it, and so he got it out there to try to embarrass them. He lost his press credentials as a result, but I don't know if it's in a hurry.
And why? So what is the Pope telling us in this encyclical?
You know, this is really one of the most remarkable documents that has come out of the Vatican in many years. And when you just listen to the opening words, he says, "We have come to see ourselves as the Lord and masters of the earth, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil and the water, in the air, and all forms of life. That is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail." I mean,
groans in travail.
Groans in travail. I mean, these are extraordinary words. And of course, you know, all of the authorities who say that climate change is not real were up in arms, you know, on the talk shows. Rush Limbaugh was bellowing away. But I think what he has done is given a tremendous amount of legitimacy to people who for years have been pushing for the kind of reforms and restraints that global warming, climate change has brought. So it was quite exciting to see all this going on. I had dinner with a journalist friend the night that the document actually came out, and he smiled and said, "You know what's going on? The Jesuits are running the church." Now, of course, this is heresy in many parts of the Western world, the idea that the Jesuits, who have been outside of the power for so long, are suddenly, if you will, in the cockpit. But one of the things he has done, there are two if you will, cabinet-level organizations at the Vatican, the Pontifical Academy for Science and the Pontifical Academy for Social Change, these two have become high-powered think tanks, and they are drawing in people from varied professions, many of them not Catholic at all. Just the other day, Naomi Klein, the Canadian writer who has pioneered the idea of disaster capitalism, been very critical of the post-Katrina cleanup. She was invited to give her paper. Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia was invited. They did a tremendous amount of groundwork getting these conferences and people on the record so that the document, which was written by a group of people, reflects a broad base of science and not just...
And religion. And bringing the
it's
two
absolutely
together.
A theological document. He opens by quoting St. Francis of Assisi, care of the earth. But I think in the long term, what he has done is forced Western governments that are feeling the pressure from the petrochemical industries, the coal industries, and others, to sort of look to their constituents. Look, if you think about the fact, at least what the Vatican says, and what even some of the American bishops are saying, is that this little book of 184 pages is going to be taught in schools, Catholic schools. It's already being discussed now and will be part of curricula at Catholic universities, and I think secular universities as well. So it's a rather sweeping development.
And is it a call to action, would you say?
Oh, I would say absolutely. Yeah.
To clean up our environment and take care of Mother Earth, or Sister Earth, really.
Sister Earth, yes, indeed. And what's also, you know, I interviewed Archbishop Amond before I left for Italy, and well, you know, the draft had not come out, but there had been a great deal of attention already to the discussions and conferences, and he said he welcomed it as a pro-life document, linking care of the earth with the idea of the seamless garment of life. Now, of course, that drives people on the left crazy, that, you know, you're not being pro-choice. Go ahead.
But also some conservatives perhaps are probably driving crazy too because of the assertion of climate change and global warming, et cetera. So there is controversy on both ends, I would guess.
And I would say that, well, Pascal says that the true mark of intelligence is to be able to touch both extremes at once. And I think the Pope did it in this one.
Okay, Mark, I'm going to have you just sort of join in on this because you have been an environmental reporter for quite a long time. You've dealt with these issues of the environment, and you even participated at another religious level.
I did. In 2009, the Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Bartholomew I, actually had, I think it was the 7th of a group of seminars called Religion, Science, and Environment here in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And the reason he brought it here was because of global warming and the effects of global warming on the Mississippi River Delta. And that process that he used was to basically try to bring together scientists, environmentalists, and religious experts to talk about how to change the language so that the public could understand what was going on. And before the one here in Louisiana, each of the ones prior to that was always on a boat, and it was for 5 days, and you couldn't get off the boat until the end. In Louisiana, unfortunately, he wanted to have a boat there, but the Mississippi Queen and the Delta Queen had already been kicked off the river, so there was nothing large enough for people to stay on. So we added it to Hilton instead. But the reality was that it helped, those sorts of events helped change the tenor. It's very much like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring changed the tenor of the environmental movement in the 1960s, the early 1960s. And this does the same thing. He uses speech to start changing the way that people feel about the environment. I'll give you an example, and this is another quote from the encyclical. If we approach nature and the environment without the openness, with awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, one attitude will be that of our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate need. And I think it's, this use of words to raise the level of discussion that is probably the most important thing about this document.
And he quotes Bartholomew in it and quotes other religious leaders. The idea that there is now an emerging spiritual vocabulary about an issue that has always been one more issue in the coverage of politics or society, I think does put it on another level. And when children are taught in school about the earth, the environment as part of a religious heritage, it does take it to a different threshold.
And about conservation, that is something also that is pointed out here in the encyclical about consumption and overconsumption and the need to conserve. What else does the Pope suggest that as an individual do to be more friendly to the earth, would you say?
Well, the book or the document doesn't really go into a laundry list of how people should change their own lives, but I think the broad sweep of what he's saying will register on anyone who reads it. I just want to say one other thing.
Yeah.
There's been so much attention on this document. The other issue that he has been absolutely hammering on, and I'm sure when he comes to America in the fall and speaks to Congress and the UN and in Philadelphia, will be part of it, is the rising crisis in Europe of refugees or migrants as they are called. I did a lot of interviews with a number of these people in Sicily and Naples who had, come across these boats on the Atlantic, and he ties. You mentioned what can the ordinary person do. He ties the continuing warfare in the Middle East, particularly Syria, to the flow of all these people going into Italy. 55,000 people alone in the first 6 months in Italy.
And of course, that is such a major concern of the Pope, is the plight of the underserved and the needs of the poor. Okay, Jason, thanks. And Mark, quickly over to Errol, and you wanted to touch on our Pelican,
All of a sudden,
who has really reached
NBA salaries seem so irrelevant after all of this. But it is a story and an economic development thing. Let me tell you, it is easier to understand the BP oil settlement than to understand the negotiating for NBA salaries. But I think it is important that Anthony Davis, who New Orleans was lucky to get as one of its players, signed a 5-year deal for $145 million. That goes into effect the year after. And I think it's important, one, because it's an economic development thing. People will be coming to New Orleans to see Anthony Davis the same way they used to go to Chicago to see Michael Jordan, or they go to Los Angeles to see Kobe Bryant. But you know, New Orleans, I think a lot of people, myself included, feel is playing a little bit above its head by a town this small having both an NBA and an NFL team. Well, we've secured our support for the NFL team. NBA team's been a little bit more of an effort. But if you have people who grow up and who one day can say, well, I grew up and my dad took me to see Anthony Davis, that maybe this is the guy that can really solidify this franchise and really just make it part of the economy and part of New Orleans. He says he's here for the rest of his career, so as long as his health remains good, I think with a good development for sports in New Orleans, and especially the way we've developed our downtown with the football stadium and the basketball arena side by side, and the things that we're doing to make that a sports entertainment district, I think what happened this week will have a lot of impact on that.
And Pelican's management wasted no time in getting that agreement with him. They moved on it immediately, as soon as they could.
Oh, they had to do it like, there was a time that they couldn't do it. And then finally, I think it was like midnight Wednesday, they could do it, and they were there at midnight. They were there and they signed it. So.
Okay, so he's with the Pelicans. It's a 5-year deal, right? And
right, so it's a 5-year deal that goes into effect in 2016.
Okay.
For next season, he just have to settle for his usual $7 million.
well, what a shame. Okay, it is time now to look ahead. Back to you, Errol.
I mentioned a few weeks ago about restaurants really looking for work, looking for help. And I've talked to more and more restaurateurs, and they say it's becoming a really serious problem, especially at the service level and at the administrative level, that they really need people. So if you know someone who wants a job, who wants a career, look at the restaurant industry, because there's good opportunities at higher-end restaurants now.
Okay, Errol, thanks. Jason.
Well, the next big move on the Pope's part will be going to Cuba in mid-September, and then to the United States. So I'm going to Cuba to do a series on the church in Cuba for the Ground Truth Project later this month and into August. And those of you who are interested in it can find it on the website, groundtruthproject.org. Lastly, on a personal note, this is my mother's 94th birthday.
Happy birthday.
Mother, we love you.
Indeed. Happy birthday. Mark.
Well, I think you can expect in the days and weeks to come that there will be significant movements on the variety of different organizations that are handling the different money streams from BP to basically consolidate the rules under which they are going to be moving forward and putting this money out onto the street.
A lot of money to talk about.
It's a lot of money.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful, happy, safe 4th, and we'll see you next week for Informed Sources. Good evening.